Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. It's a great chance to come to Amsterdam, so I was very pleased to take it. And I think there's some really great continuities between what Morten was saying and what I'm going to be saying around the issue of poor numbers and understanding reality. But let's turn that question now to the issue of cities and the future of cities, and again in Africa. So there seem to be two different stories circulating about Africa at the moment. One of those stories is what one might call the depressing story. The Africa as the dark continent story. And that story refers most often to these kinds of figures, particularly about the really rapid rate of urbanization. Our absolute numbers are smaller than Asia, but still growing very rapidly. Imagine every African city doubling in size in the next 20 years. That is a really scary prospect. With that growth happening primarily in peri-urban areas around cities, in secondary cities, very often because people are trying to escape the land rules and regulations which apply in the larger and core cities. So very rapid urbanization, accompanied by, and we know statistics lie, but these are the ones that have been circulating, very large numbers of people living below poverty lines, very large numbers of people living in slums, relying on erratic income in the informal economy and so on. And we know that Africa is very diverse. We cannot generalize. But if we are going to make a general statement, these are the numbers that surface in the depressing story of Africa. Less than 1 in 4 people having a bank account, and the MDGs monitoring progress, which we heard of a moment ago, in the African context, very often come up with sad stories there as well. If you have a look at the infrastructure needs in many African countries, and this is countrywide, if you look at the need not only to catch up with infrastructure needs, but also to cater for this very rapidly growing urban population, again, the figures are alarming, and particularly notes the issue of power. Many African countries increasingly now having power blackouts several times a week, even a day. And then very important things like water and sanitation as well. $93 billion a year needed to try and catch up and keep up with infrastructure needs is the figure that circulates. There's one interesting fact about Africa, because very often there's an assumed correlation between urbanization, rising urban growth, and a growth in income. And in many parts of the world, that indeed has been the case. Certainly in the global north and in many Asian countries, urbanization has meant a gradual increase in wealth, in income, and so on. The African picture is different, okay? We have a phenomenon in many African countries, not all, of course, of backward sloping relationship between urbanization and income. There certainly may be growth because of a resources boom that has been taking place, but that does not translate into urban jobs and increasing urban income, largely because of what is called the resource curse, which is when African governments do not spend their profits on investing in urban infrastructure, but spend it on a variety of other things. So cities are growing, they're growing rapidly, but not with the usual growth in investment, industrialization, and jobs that have happened elsewhere. And this contributes, I think, to the depressing story of Africa. And then the pattern of growth in cities is probably a well-known one as well. And you can see that it's largely West Africa that is experiencing very rapid growth, East Africa as well, with Southern Africa having largely leveled off. So particular parts of the continent that are experiencing this very, very rapid growth. So this story would argue that African cities represent what might be called the perfect storm. A whole range of negative trends in water, energy, food, and so on, coming together to wipe out the precious recent potential gains that may have been happening in African economies. And the prospects for the future are dismal. That has been one story, and it is there. But you probably have heard the other story as well, and Morten referred to this, the Africa Rising story. Africa is the hopeful continent, the site of the next wave of global economic development. African economy is growing more rapidly than anywhere else in the world, off a very small base, let us add. All sorts of indicators like increases in cell phone use and so on, used to suggest that things are now really moving ahead. And particularly the figures, and Morten will appreciate this one, around the size of the African middle class, and here the arguments go that the urban middle class has tripled in size over the last 30 years and is now one of the fastest growing in the world. And these particular figures came out from the Africa Development Bank 3 or 4 years ago and have been widely cited ever since. I will come back to those figures. So this story, the rising story, combined with rapid urbanization, has had a particular impact on cities in many parts of the continent. It is true that there has been a rising middle class. We'll talk about the size of it later on. But when you get growing wealth in cities that are growing rapidly anyway, you get growing demands for land. You get growing demands for roads, shopping malls, suburban housing, and so on. And it has been very disturbing to me to find on the websites of companies like property developers and architects and project managers these kinds of statements. Africa is the last frontier for the property development industry. Okay, and this is the way in which many African cities are now seen, particularly by those involved in real estate investment. The rest of the world has been cleared up, developed, although obviously India and the East still has some opportunities, but here is Africa, terra nullius, ripe for the taking. Okay, and this is suggesting a particular perception on the part of a certain grouping of investors and developers about African cities. But what the outcome is of these two, and probably both of these stories have some truth to some degree, and when you get these two kinds of stories colliding in any African cities, the inevitable outcome is dramatically increasing inequalities between rich and poor, dramatically increasing inequalities between informal settlements and slums, the poorer parts of the cities, and enclaves for the rich. So what we are looking at, despite which story you go for, is really radical and rapid growing urban inequality, both in terms of population, but also very much in terms of the built environment. And that, as a planner, for me, is of major concern. So as a planner in Africa, and that is my home, I'm very concerned about the future of African cities. Certainly how to deal with the incredibly rapid growth of cities and the continuation of poverty and slums and unemployment, but also how to deal with what I'm going to talk about now, which is a new brand of planning, which seems to be hitting the continent in an incredibly alarming way. Now, urban planning in Africa has had a lot of bad press, and it is absolutely true that planning in many African countries has been in a poor state. Often plans inherited from colonial governments and changed very little in the intervening years, completely inappropriate for the kinds of cities which we have in Africa now. So certainly nothing good about much of the planning that has happened to date. But post-2008, something new has happened in the planning fields. And no longer do you find plans for major African cities on the shelves of dusty municipal offices. You now find new plans for African cities on the websites of the major property development, architecture, engineering companies around the world, particularly in the global north and also in the east. And is very much a post-2008 phenomenon. And the financial crisis in 2008, I guess, has quite a bit to do with it. So if you have a look at this new planning, okay, that is emerged and is dominating across much of the continent, there are three kinds of plans that one can find. And I've called them the full city makeover, edge cities, and satellite cities. And these go under a variety of names, but very often the label of sustainable cities, eco-cities has been used, world-class cities, very common. And more recently, but only one or two of them so far, smart cities, in other words, cities driven by many definitions here, Stephen, for smart cities, but driven by technology in some form or other. So I'm going to run through a set of pictures now, largely, just to show you what these new plans for African cities look like, and how the future of African cities might be panning out. Let's start with the full city makeover, of which I only have one city, which is Kigali, capital of Rwanda, which has really good clear graphics. Okay. Kigali is a city which a few years ago was largely informal, about 80% informal according to UN Habitat figures. It's a government that brooks very little in the way of disagreement. And in 2008, they adopted a plan which was put together by Oz Architects, which is a United States firm of architects and landscape architects, which won a prize for it. And this is their vision of the future of Kigali. And what do you see there? Echoes of Dubai, echoes of Shanghai and Singapore. There's a little bit of those who know London will recognize the gherkin put in for good measure. But glass box buildings, landscape lawns, no sign of informal traders or people without homes, not even the peanut seller, Milton. This is their future. Just think of the power supply that will be needed to keep that going. Here's another one of Kigali's future. Again, it's glass boxes, paved landscapes, relatively few people, no informal traders, car-related transport, and that is called a sustainable future city. Now, Rwanda being Rwanda, it was adopted by the government, and from people who have been there recently, they tell me that it is in fact being rolled out. Informal settlements are being removed, the land is being cleared, and new buildings are raising from the earth. Now, Addis, Ethiopia has hard to get their graphics, but there certainly is a similar full city makeover on the move there. Although farmers around Addis revolted 2 weeks ago, 140 of them were shot, but the master plan was, as a result, withdrawn, and we'll see what comes in its place. Okay, let's move on to edge cities, which is another favorite on the websites. This one's been around for a little while. Kinshasa, about 8 million people, war-ravaged city, many high levels of poverty. But this is an infill on the Congo River. And if you go into Google Earth, you can see it. The land is quite clearly there. And this is the future vision of this now, what will be a very large part of Kinshasa. Put together by Hawkwood Properties, a US-UK company. And note the strapline on the website. This will be a model for the rest of Africa, showcase for a new era of African economic development. Okay, it's about how the rest of the world sees us, not how we respond to the demands of our citizens, but about how we are regarded internationally. Eco-Atlantic on the coast of Lagos has been going a little bit longer. This was late 2007. Again, a very large infill, very visible on Google Earth. Planned to accommodate about 250,000 people. A head office in Beirut this time. But again, look at the graphics. All these graphics are taken from a number of websites which architects use, and you can simply cut and paste and put onto a piece of land. You don't have to even go there. Kigamboni City in Dar es Salaam, labeled an eco-city. A very large piece of land, less developed, quite central and on the coast in Dar es Salaam, which has now been earmarked for another one of these fantasy cities. And there really is not a person in sight there, never mind an informal trader. This was strongly promoted by Anna Tabayuka, who used to head UN Habitat, and was well known for castigating planners for chasing the poor out of cities. Well, she left UN Habitat. She went into the ministry in housing ministry in Tanzania, and this was her first project. Okay, there are 80,000 households, poor households, living on this piece of land in Dar es Salaam, and they resisted, and they managed to slow the project. In the meantime, Anna Tabayuka was kicked out of the Tanzanian government for corruption, and the project has gone on to indefinite hold. We'll see what happens to that one. Gauteng this is the first, quite big one, the New York of Africa, a piece of empty land in the middle of Johannesburg, but again, just look at the graphics. And then we get on to the third type, which is tending to be a very common form of fantasy city, and that is the satellite city. In other words, a new city right outside the boundaries of the existing city. We find a lot of these. Now, one that has had quite a bit of press, BBC was running stories on it for a while, the Chinese ghost cities, about 60 kilometers outside of Luanda, built by the Chinese, apartments which were then sold at $200,000 plus each. And because nobody in Angola could afford them, this city sat empty for a very long time. Later in the talk, I'll come on to what happened in the end of that story. But this was a classic case of a satellite city built and then basically becoming a white elephant. Hope City, a satellite of Accra in Ghana, drawn up by an Italian architect who I'm sure never left his office, who saw this city as beehives in the Ghanaian landscape. You never have to go outside of these buildings. You can work, live, play within this containment, and that is all you will ever see of the outside world. The new Cairo in the desert, 5 million people, similar sorts of graphics. And then Nairobi, which has a number of satellite cities as part of their 2030 plan. Here is Tatu City, a satellite of Nairobi, about 16 kilometers outside. This is the plan, which has been around for some time now, but on the ground, the reality is still this. In other words, the billboards are up, but the land is still completely empty. And here is another one of Nairobi's satellite cities. This is the only other one I know of in Africa that's been called a techno or smart city, Konza City. And again, the graphics start to become boringly familiar. What kind of African city are these architects actually imagining, and for who? So Konza is quite an interesting one, because there's Nairobi, okay? Konza is some 60-odd kilometers outside of Nairobi. Given Nairobi traffic, that's probably about a 3-hour drive, okay? It's off the main route. I believe the land was owned by some government minister, which is how it ended up there, but we're not sure about that one. But this has been called, and look again at the inspiration for this. Familiar names: Deloitte and Paul Frischmann, launched in 2013 as the big new smart city for Nairobi and for Africa, a sustainable, world-class technology hub. Now, again, I know somebody who drives past this site about once a week, and I ask for a regular update. And there is still nothing on the ground. And again, here there was local resistance. It was not terra nullius, as the developers like to think. The land was occupied by quite a lot of small farmers who did not particularly want to give up their land to some other kind of development. Took the developers to court, and the whole thing has again stalled, although stories on the website keep trying to kind of relaunch it. In fact, the city gets relaunched every year. So this may be an indication of what happens to many of these sorts of developments. So I've showed you a range of pictures, a range of kinds of new fantasy plans. Let's get to a bit of sort of analysis of this. What is driving this largely post-2008 scramble for African real estate? Well, there are a number of possible different reasons, and clearly the top one is profit. Untapped markets, consumerism, the international real estate and development industry hoping to make a quick buck is probably an absolutely key driving force here, but it's not the only one. And this is what makes it complex and interesting, because there are all sorts of other sectors that line up behind this vision. There's certainly an understanding of land as a commodity that runs through all these stories. It's the liberal property logic of land as there is a commodity to be used. A very different way of understanding land from many of the people who live on this land and live in African cities, but that's the notion. Land is there to buy and sell. The whole idea of creating world-class cities is a rhetoric that comes to the fore very often. And this is usually a rhetoric which is heavily punted by the local politicians at national and local level. Because you have to have political backup to get any of these off the ground, quite clearly. So it's called symbolic power. It's being able to say to the rest of the world, we have world-class cities. Okay, again, not a concern with what the residents of current cities might need, but what the rest of the world might think about you. And then the other rhetoric that seems to be driving it has been for a long time the eco-city rhetoric. We want to create sustainable cities, and increasingly now the smart city rhetoric, which has been very widespread elsewhere, surprisingly absent in Africa until recently, but is now starting to creep in. And I think, Stephen, we're going to see more of it. Yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about these. And if you look at the question of profit, what is driving these is profit. And a lot of the argument here comes back to the size of this middle class. And this is something Morten will certainly understand. As I said before, the African Development Bank came up with a definition of the middle class a little while ago that said those spending between $2 and $20 a day are middle class. Okay, the upper middle class are those who spend between $10 and $20 a day. Now, can people who are only able to spend that amount of money a day actually be called the middle class and afford apartments of 150 to 200,000 rand, as they suggested in Angola? The kind of luxury accommodation you see in the graphics. That figure was widely touted for a long time. The Standard Bank did a different set of figures some years later and came up with a very different set of idea of how you define the middle class. But I would say that the definition of the middle class in African cities has been hugely overinflated. Certainly, it's there. It's certainly growing. But whether those are the right numbers and whether those sorts of people with those sorts of income can afford top quality luxury accommodation, I think the developers will find is a bad mistake. And the Chinese ghost cities were a good example of that. And I will come back to that story again. Because here, very expensive apartments, literally nobody could afford them. This question of world-class city status is an interesting one, because it seems to me that politicians in many African countries are very easily and quickly persuaded that these kinds of urban developments are a good idea. That somehow it will make Africa catch up with the rest of the world. I mean, it's horrifying that is still an ambition. What's wrong with our own world, by the way? Somehow achieve modernization, whatever that may mean. And that seems to drive politicians, and it's probably a few trips to nice conferences to talk about them that helps as well. But that seems to drive the strong political support which many of these projects seem to get. But as we've seen, it's one thing to talk about them. Many of them have already been stalled by some quite obvious things. Resistance from people on the ground where these projects are planned, and also by the shortage of infrastructure. You remember the infrastructure figures I showed earlier on, and particularly the power shortages. How that lack of infrastructure can possibly catch up to supporting these kinds of developments is another very big gap. And then this question of smart city and eco-city, and those are very nice terms. Of course, we all want sustainable cities, and we all want cities that use technology to make our lives better. And there's no doubt about that. But I promise you, in just about every one of these examples, let's say every one of these examples, it's an advertising line. And when you have a look at the actual content, these cities are neither sustainable nor are they smart. One can go into a whole lot of detail about what makes a sustainable city and what makes a smart city, and I can promise you none of those requirements are here for that. This is what we call urban boosterism. And there's a growing argument in the smart city literature about urban boosterism versus real smart, that I'm sure Stephen knows a lot about. So we have to understand that rolling out these fantasy cities in Africa, there's a layer of very different and often competing interests at play. So you can't look at this question simplistically. There's the national and local politicians that see it as becoming famous. Then there's a whole problem of public funding priorities, and where does the money actually go? Where does it come from in the national coffers to fund these things? And are these the priority in terms of where government spending starts to go? And then you have a whole layer of local property developers and financiers who are equally keen to get a slice of the pie. So they also like these. And these international firms very often make clever alignments with local property developers and local banks to try and push these ideas. And local urban professionals are very often jumping on the bandwagon as well. Planners, architects, engineers. And then you have the local landowners and communities Some may hope to get rich from compensation for their land. Others know they will simply be expelled and their livelihoods will be destroyed. So in trying to unpack and understand this new kind of planning in Africa, we have to understand the wide range of different stakeholders. And then we have to look locally at things like the local regulatory system, the local planning system, land tenure systems, available infrastructure, local banking systems. 1 in 4 people have a bank account, and those sorts of things. So actually landing one of these projects on the ground and developing it, however horrific the outcome may be, is going to jump through an awful lot of hoops before it actually gets there.
Vanessa, could you, a couple more minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I did start late. So my feeling is that these plans are likely to have a massive negative effect on African cities. They completely ignore the real and urgent issues of most African cities, which is the vast majority of people in most of these cities need sanitation, water, shelter as a basic starting point. And these plans are simply skewing attention and skewing investment away from these very large and very immediate priorities. They're leading already, as we've seen in Kigali, to large-scale evictions. The only way that the Chinese ghost cities finally managed to get some of the apartments sold was when the Angolan government diverted almost the entire housing subsidy budget into subsidizing these apartments, bringing the cost down to something like $50,000, where some people could afford them, and then they started to fill up. A very good example of how public money is skewed in order to make these things work. If these new developments happen, they're entirely exclusive, okay? Most people who live in African cities, who are mostly poor, will neither live nor work in these kinds of environments. It is way beyond their affordability. And we know from planning, we have a long history of attempting satellite towns, right the way back from garden cities to Milton Keynes and so on, and we know a lot about them now. And we know that they cost, there's a very large infrastructure spend involved in satellite cities because they can't link up to existing city bulks. They take many decades often to become self-sufficient because the residence goes first, the jobs only come much later. In between, people move back often on a daily basis to the mother city to take advantage of jobs and facilities. Traffic generation out of these sorts of things is massive. And they can only survive, and we have a long history of these in South Africa as well from the apartheid days, they can only survive with ongoing and large-scale government subsidies for capital and maintenance. Satellite cities are a bad idea. The governance issue is another important one as well. Getting these kinds of urban developments off the ground needs high levels of governance capacity and resources, missing in many African contexts. There's almost no participation, no consultation that has taken place in every one of these projects. People are simply not consulted. They are simply declared to be happening. So, and this is the last couple of slides now. I mean, the question is always, well, what's the alternative? Are there alternatives for pro-poor, sustainable, equitable, just urban development? And what does that mean for professions such as ours, urban planners and geomatics? And I have become quite heartened by some of the debates that are going around the upcoming Habitat 3 conference. Despite the issues of how many SDGs and how many indicators, absolutely very problematic. They are, however, there's a greater emphasis now, I think, on equality, inclusiveness, and sustainability. There's a very clear statement in the UN Habitat documents that freehold urban tenure rarely works for the poor, that we have to look at alternative and incremental forms of tenure, a continuation of land rights, if you like, which is important. We have to be able to accept in situ upgrade of informal settlements, not removal. Finding ways to record land allocations without removal, land readjustment strategies, all good ideas here. Involvement of communities in data creation, the self-enumeration that Slum Dwellers International carries out, and developing plans is absolutely essential. So coming out of the Habitat 3 process, and coming out particularly of the attempt to form an African urban agenda within Habitat 3, I think there's some encouraging ideas. And certainly the understanding that what we need to be doing is to be linking questions of planned city extension, because cities are growing, the legal framework and governance, and the urban economy and finance. And those three things have to come together very closely. Talking about urban extension, Solly Angel's notion of a grid of dirt roads, which starts to expand cities, I think is an interesting one. It's at the right kind of level to cater for what we already have in the urban periphery. Urban planning and land management laws which do not impose additional cost burdens on the poor. That is what they're trying to escape right now. That's why they're running out of the cities to the peri-urban areas. Cannot introduce new laws which impose new cost burdens. Essential law, we may call it. And then land finance systems that work appropriately and can be redistributed. Very hard to find good examples of how this might have happened. There's just one I've come across in Nairobi, the Muungano Kabamoto project, which is a SDI project, a community land trust where a community got together, pooled their savings, and themselves built these 4 square meters at the bottom, 4 stories up, kind of housing which is affordable. The government came to the party with land, and the community did the rest. So it's these kind of models that I think we need to be looking at, and not the fantasy cities that seem to be now invading every country on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.